So I'm back with another vertical video because I failed to plan ahead when I was dyeing yarn, which you'll see later on in this kind of clip that I'm putting together. It's vertical and I didn't want to be, can't think of the word, but I didn't want to transition between vertical and horizontal videos. This video today is going to talk a little bit about a project I'm currently working on. So I found out about the, Traveling Seasons Afghan, I think in December, right before it got released in January. It's a collaboration project between Lion Brand and a bunch of different designers. Each month someone will release a block that's part of this afghan. It's themed around seasons, the 4 seasons. They will release it on their blog, and then they make a square and send it off to the next designer. So eventually at the end you'll have a blanket that has traveled to 12 different people. Yes, 12 different people who have each contributed a square. And so they release these patterns. I think there's a free and a paid version, I believe. On the first day of each month. So today is the 24th. There are currently 2 squares out. And then the next one will release, I believe, March 1st. Pretty sure it's the first of the month. And I love season-themed things, and I thought it would make for a really pretty blanket to have in my apartment. So with it being a partnership with Lion Brand, they of course recommend working with Lion Brand yarn. I think this year's yarn is Woolies, I think. I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to that. Mainly because I decided that I wanted to use different colors. So they're using like a grayish solid color for all 12 blocks. And it's a pretty color. It's solid so that it works really well for letting the stitch work of each square show. So far the 2 squares that have been released have been pretty textured. So I think the first one was like clusters of raindrops, and the second one had some kind of like flower stitch work on it. So it makes sense to have a solid colored yarn or a pretty plain colored yarn to allow for that kind of pattern to show and not get lost in like variegated yarn. But I thought it would be fun to do, like, each row is going to be a season. So it goes spring, summer, fall, winter. There are 3 squares across, and then obviously 4 rows. And I decided that I wanted to do, instead of the whole thing one color, I wanted to do each row in a color that represents the season. And I decided to choose those colors by brainstorming colors that made me think of those seasons where I grew up. I thought that would be kind of like a more personal take on my color choice. And I mean, at the end of the day, some things, well, I didn't get too deep or anything, but I'm pretty happy with my color choices. I'll put in a clip of the image I ended up going with to decide my color choices. But before I do that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm doing. So once I decided I wanted each row to be its own color, I started searching for like just yarn I could buy at a chain craft store so that I could just use that, keep it easy. It looks like about 1 square will roughly be 1 skein of yarn-ish, depending on the yarn, obviously. For what I ended up going with, that's about the case. I'm sure it'll depend on each square, but that's how I'm estimating it. And And so I started my search by looking at like Joann and Michaels, some of the brands that I was familiar with. The first blog post also recommended some substitute yarn brands and types of yarn that you could use instead of what they were doing for the recommended yarn. And so I looked through those. I looked through other worsted weight yarns that I was familiar with, and I thought I'd found some color combinations that I could make work and that I'd like the way it looked together. So I don't have them anymore, I deleted them, but I initially put together a collage. I went nuts. I think I put like, I don't know, 20 different combinations together with just while I was trying to figure out what colors I wanted to use to represent each season. And because you should never trust the way a photo looks online, because everyone's screen settings could be different and things like that mess with how colors come through. The next time I was in town where we have a Joann and a Michaels, I went in the store, compared them in person when I thought I'd narrowed down what I wanted to do, and decided in person I did not like the way they looked together at all. In fact, it looked pretty terrible. So I'm glad I didn't end up ordering the yarn online, because I would have been pretty disappointed and probably pretty disheartened about the project. So anyway, it was back to square one. I had pulled inspiration photos of different seasons at the beginning when I was first looking for like chain yarn, store-bought yarn. And I went back to those photos, pulled some colors out of that, and went into, I like to use Canva to create images and play with things. So I went into Canva and pulled those colors side by side, and I needed to come up with a way to make those colors work together, because the colors I wanted to use, I ended up using yellow for spring, because daffodils are my favorite flower. They bloom in the spring, and my mom has like a whole flower bed that just blooms with daffodils in the springtime. So yellow for spring, blue for summer, because I grew up in a desert, and during the summer, especially the last few years before I moved out to go to college, I spent my summers working outside and just being so disheartened at looking at the beautiful blue sky, but how hot it was, and working outside in it. And so the cloudless blue sky is where I pulled my summer inspiration, because that is a pretty vibrant image in my mind when I think of summer. Summer's my least favorite season. So that cloudless blue sky, that just meant it was going to be a really hot day. That's where I got the blue. Fall, for me, there were only so many colors that I would have considered, but I ended up choosing orange for obvious reasons. My parents' yard is full of trees, and so every fall there's always lots of leaves on the ground. And then winter, because I set myself a rule that I didn't want the same color representing more than one season, and I didn't want to do white as a square color because I thought that would be too harsh. I decided to pick like a dusty purple is kind of what it ended up being. And basically I needed to make all of those colors go together, because depending on the hue that you use, I hope that's the right color term, I know I learned them at some point, but what kind of orange you use, or what kind of yellow you use, or what kind of blue and purple, to me at least, you know, everyone has their own color preferences, aesthetics, but for me, I knew there needed to be something to tie it together. So I picked base colors, and so like my yellow is pretty pale, my blue is not like a baby blue, but I would say it's definitely more on the lighter sky, like a sky blue. And then my orange is pretty deep. It's the deepest color of them all. And then my purple, which I'd say is probably kind of like the blue, where it's not like a pale pastel color, but it's a lighter shade, I would say. And so I needed to find a way to have all of those go together. And that is when I decided that I would mute them back, make them more like earthy toned. Basically added gray when I was in the app, trying to play with what shades would work together the best. So that is what I ended up going with. I will now insert a photo of what that final color palette ended up looking like. I even arranged it in strips to kind of see what it would look like as a whole blanket. I'll probably end up doing probably something neutral for the border. I haven't gotten that far yet, but I'm sure I don't know if the blanket will actually do a border, but I'm sure I will add a border because I just like the way borders on blankets look. But in arriving to my conclusion, I realized it would be a good way to experiment even further with dyeing yarn and seeing how colors work between, like when you're dyeing it and it's wet yarn versus dry yarn, and just kind of learning the relationship that happens in that process and how the colors change. I worked in polymer clay before I got back into crochet and knitting, because I've done that much longer. But it was a similar process there, where you just learn and get a feel for how much the color of clay changes before and after baking. And the same goes for yarn dyeing when it's wet. So far I'm noticing it's typically darker, and then when it dries it's lighter. So I just have to get better at feeling what that change looks like so I can better estimate how I need to mix my color beforehand. That's been the hardest part, especially since I am working with, like, I don't expect to perfectly match my color inspiration photo, obviously, because the nature of hand-dyed yarn, even if I could with one skein or one batch, no two batches are gonna be exactly the same. That's just the nature of the way it goes. So I'm not expecting that, but I would like to get close, because there's a reason that I went through the color planning process to begin with. There's a reason that I needed to go through and get that figured out first, because it could become disastrous very quickly having those colors together, in my opinion. Again, I'll say that. So this video is just kind of going to be going through what I did for the spring color, my first yellow colorway, and basically it's going to be me just chatting about the process. I have some what are they called, time-lapse clips of me actually dyeing the yarn, and then me regurgitating my thoughts about how everything's been going. If this is something you would like to see for the other colors that I do while I'm stumbling through this experiment, please let me know in the comments. Right now I've planned to do this for spring. I haven't started dyeing the summer color yet, but if more people, and maybe I'll just refer to this kind of intro video for the whole series, and then the other videos will just be maybe like a time lapse of me dyeing those colors. Maybe that's what I'll do. So anyway, let me know what you think in the comments, and I'm gonna jump out here and let the rest of the video go. I forgot to also mention that this is my first time dyeing and trying to recreate the same color across not just more than one skein of yarn, but more than one batch. I think it's kettle dyeing is the method I'm using. I'm just submerging my yarn in a pot of water and dyeing it all there to get a semi-solid color. And I can only fit, I don't know what size the pot is, but I can only fit 2 skeins of my worsted weight yarn at a time. The yarn I'm using is a superwash merino. I think it's just wool. I don't know if it's blend. It might be a nylon blend. I'll put that in the description. But it's from Dyer Supplier. I just bought a bunch of 5-packs so that I could do 4 skeins of each color, because I figured for 3 squares I'll need about 3 skeins based on the yardage that the first square had listed for what it used, and then how many yards are in each skein of yarn. So to be safe, I figured I'd dye 4 skeins so that I can alternate and have more than enough for the 3 squares, and then it gives me 1 extra skein that I have in a pack just in case something goes wrong. And then across all 4 colors I'll have 4 extra skeins so that if, you know, my batch of blue goes terribly wrong, I can pull some extras from those packages and hopefully at the end have enough yarn to dye for all of the colors. So I had to do 2 skeins and 2 batches, so I made sure to take fairly careful notes. My measurements aren't super scientific or exact by any means, but I am taking notes of how much water I used, when I changed the temperature for things, how many drops of food coloring. I think that's about it. So I'm measuring my food coloring with drops, and that's basically me eyeballing how big the drop is. But I feel like it's been pretty consistent because I've had pretty good results, at least so far, with the 1 color I've done in replicating the color between 2 batches. We'll see how that goes once I start doing the other colors, but that is just some background information on how I am dyeing these. So this is my first attempt, and I'll say I think it's coming through pretty accurately. I don't know, I mixed up I think it's coming through pretty accurately on the camera. I would say it's it'd be helpful if I had better terminology for colors in my brain. It's like the shade of yellow that I want, because I want it to be on the lighter side, but I was also trying to tone down my colors. I'm putting some colors together that I wouldn't normally put together, and so one of the ways that I can make that work is by muting them and having that same kind of like grayish tinge carried through each of them, and that's what helps tie the colors together. So I like the shade of yellow this is sitting at, but I realized it's a little too bright. I didn't quite tone it back enough. I did add colors to make it brown, a little bit brown. so that it wouldn't be as vibrant, but it wasn't quite enough. So this is my first batch. I have 2 skeins of this. I have a second batch where I attempted to make up for it, but again, because I'm still learning what ratio, like what it looks like wet versus what I think it'll do once it dries, I wanted to err on the side of needing to over dye it later, because I can add, at least I think, it's a theory at this point, I can go back and over dye it to tone it down, but if I go too far, I can't brighten it back up. So I'd rather take an additional step, since I'm just experimenting. I mean, this is just for me learning. I'm going to attempt to over dye this to tone it down. I think I need to, the other set's still drying, so I'm not sure where that's at yet, but I took notes for what I did with that batch to see if it was enough. Then I could do it with this one. If not, I'll do some more experimenting. But I was going for a pretty even tonal color. I'm making a blanket and it's going to have lots of stitches and texture, and I don't want that to be lost in a bunch of pretty variegated yarn. I do not hate this color by any means. I actually really like this color, but I do have a certain vision that I want, and I am going to do my best to achieve it. So I will probably take another stab at changing this colorway this weekend, because that should give enough time for my second batch to dry, and then I can see how the two compare, if the other one is any more muted than this one, if they both need to be adjusted, and then go from there. So I had gone back to my yellow yarn, and after deciding that it was too bright, it was the right shade that I was going for, but it was just too yellow, too vibrant. I needed to tone it down a bit. I ended up letting it all dry to make sure I could see what the dried color was looking like, and then I compared the 2 different batches. So in order to tone it down, it's pretty cool. You just have to mix in some of the complementary color, and for yellow that is purple. So I mixed up a pot of water, threw in, no, I didn't throw in vinegar at the beginning. I wanted, so just pot of water and some purple food coloring to make, it was purple water, and I threw in 2 at a time my yellow yarn, and once it dried, sorry, I'm picking them up here, I had this. So these are the 4 skeins. And I had the water was cool when I added the yarn. And then after I dipped everything in and made sure that it had a chance to really absorb the purple color, that is when I added vinegar to really make sure it would hold the color. And then I heated it all up to set the color. So I do notice that this is all dry now. For the most part, they look pretty even. I'm pretty happy with how even they look across the 4 skeins. But I do see that there are spots where the purple food coloring landed. Let's see. I know there's some spots that are more obvious than others. And of course now I can't find them, but you can probably see it on camera. It looks like there might be, no, see, the shadowing on what's showing up on the camera even looks more purple than what it actually does, but there are some like pink spots that are on the yarn in places, and I'm not too worried about that because I think it's still pretty much the color that I was going for, and I'm going to be alternating skeins so that if there is variation, which I'm sure there is just to the human eye, to my human eye, it looks pretty spot on between all 4 of them, at least for my standards. So that is my yellow yarn. This is what I'll begin to kick up. Oh, see, yeah, that's a good example. So there's purple. I will cake these up and get started on my squares. There's 2 that are currently out, and I'll be able to see how it's working up in all of its glory. But I'm pretty excited to have this first batch completed. The challenge will now be carrying on the same tone of muteness, muted colors for the other 3 so that they still coordinate. But I just over-dyed over my original yellow, and it worked pretty well. I'm pretty pleased. I wasn't sure, and it was a little intimidating throwing this yellow yarn in a purple water bath because I was worried that it was gonna start making it gross looking, but I just kept a really light hand with the purple food coloring, and just kind of added a blanket of gray, if you will, to the whole thing. Sorry for the weird angle. I was trying to film this a little bit different, but I wanted to show my finished block. Let's focus there. Worked up with the yellow spring yarn that I dyed. And I think it's super pretty. You can see that there's variation in the color because that's just the nature of hand-dyed yarn. There's some darker tones and some lighter tones. I did alternate skeins, but I think overall it turned out really lovely. Even some of the purples or the pinkish from when I was over-dyeing with purple is showing through, and I actually can't say that I hate that at all. I think it's really pretty. So, super pleased with how this turned out. I think it looks really good. The shadow from the baubles is kind of throwing everything off, but hopefully you get the picture.